Welcome back to the show. It's been 14 years since the deadliest terror attacks on American soil. We're talking about, with our distinguished panel, about the impact 9/11 had on the Muslim community in the United States. And Arsalan, let me get back to you. You know, we've heard a lot about how public attitudes in the United States have changed since 2001. But what about political rhetoric? There were studies done by the Justice Department, by the ACLU, by the Southern Law Poverty Center, as you mentioned earlier on, which show that anti-American sentiment, anti-Muslim sentiment rather, from politicians has increased.
It has, because, you know, many people in the Republican Party have, you know, essentially used Islam and Muslims as a successful wedge issue and as a political football. I mean, in the weeks after 9/11, we had Republican congressmen who were quoted as saying that we should shoot every Muslim that crosses the state line. Instead of getting voted out of office, they actually got promoted and are now the senior senator from the state of Georgia. You know, we had a congressman who talked about racial profiling and said that if I see a guy who walks in with a diaper on his head and a fan belt wrapped around that diaper, that guy needs to be pulled over. The very infamous right-wing columnist Ann Coulter said that we should kill their leaders and convert them to Christianity, that our post-9/11 racial profiling motto should be raghead talks tough, raghead faces consequences. I could spend an entire hour just talking about the rhetoric coming from some of the so-called intelligentsia and some of the, you know, key political leaders, and I think that is, you know, the key driving force behind pushing some of these negative public opinions out there. Because again, remember, this is not happening in a vacuum here. You know, the average American is undereducated, if not completely ignorant about Islam, and so they're getting these negative views from their elected leaders.
And you had personal experience.
Yes, and when you couple what you know, what has been said right now with also media images, very forceful media images, with what's happening, for example, from some fringes of terrorist radical groups like ISIS and others, that increases, unfortunately, the profiling of Muslims in this country and gives them, you know, a bad image in the public's eye. So I had this personal incident. I was coming back on a train from, you know, Philadelphia to Washington, D.C., and I was approached by this young white man who said to me, "Where are you going?" And I said, "I'm just going to Washington, D.C." And he said, "Oh, wow, look at her. She's going to Washington, D.C. I thought you're going to Iran, Iraq, or Afghanistan." Of course, I tell my students there's no such thing as Iran and Iraq. It's Iran and Iraq. But that's what he said. You're going to Iran, Iraq, or Afghanistan. So I said to myself, oh my God, he's coupling bad pronunciation with bad attitudes. And I just walked away from him. But this incident is very telling. I lived here for 8 years plus, and I never really encountered such an incident. And I know of friends and, you know, very close people to me who are really, you know, encountered similar incidents, you know, being assaulted or, you know, being spit on their face just because they're wearing the hijab, they're wearing the headscarf.
Well, and again, for, you know, for those of us American Muslims who were born and raised here, I mean, even our sense of Americanism has been called into question. I remember once I was doing a live nationally televised interview on an American network that will remain nameless, Fox News, and immediately after we cut to commercial, the news anchor, she looks at me and she goes, "That was a great interview. Your accent didn't come through at all. Where are you from?" And I said, "Chicago." And she goes, "No, where are you really from?" And I said, "Chicago." And she said, "No, where are you really from?" And I said, "Chicago," and I walked out of the studio. You know, for her, she could not fathom that a brown man would be able to walk into her television studio, be able to articulate himself in a live 7-minute nationally televised debate without having some sort of stereotypical bobbleheaded accent, right?
But it was also guilt by association, because they also asked Arsalan whether or not he supported ISIS. By virtue of his Muslimness, somehow, apparently, another network, which won't be named,
assumption that you support these radical groups. Wajahat, another thing, and that is, what role did the media play in the aftermath of 2011 in reinforcing these stereotypes about Muslims, in promoting anti-Muslim rhetoric?
But look, the media, unfortunately, whatever the media is, we're people of the media. You know, we're in the media, right?
Yeah.
You know, media is not a monolithic entity. It's not this evil boogeyman. It's comprised of individuals, and as we know, with the media, it's a neutral entity. If it bleeds, it leads, and unfortunately, there's been a lot of bloodletting in Muslim-majority countries. There's been lots of sensationalism. Media has a huge role. We did the research called Fear Incorporated, the Roots of the Islamophobia Network in America, was released by the Center for American Progress. And we showed how Islamophobia, and specifically this anti-Muslim sentiment that the guests have talked about, has really increased due to 5 groups, real quick. The funders who support the think tanks that create many of these memes, like the anti-Sharia legislation, which is about as useful as the anti-unicorn and anti-Bigfoot legislation. We also saw politicians that Arsalan just mentioned. And also one of them is grassroots groups and the media. When it came to mainstream media specifically, what you saw was a vacuum in narratives. You saw a missing narrative of American Muslims who've lived their lives, like Arsalan's from Chicago. Dr. Samar is here from Maryland. Not your average Joes and Jose's and Habibs, right? What you saw was Osama bin Laden. You saw now ISIS, you see sensationalism, and you saw 1,400 years of Islamic civilization reduced to talking points between us versus them. Really, quite literally, the barbarism. And Christopher Bale, who's an academic sociologist, released a fantastic book called Terrified. He did a study after 9/11 when it comes to the media. And he said by 2008, when it came to the mainstream media representation of Islam and Muslims, the talking points were actually created mostly by the Islamophobia network. People like Pam Geller, people like David Horowitz, people like Gaffney and Spencer. And he said that these talking points and these talking heads quite literally created the narrative that led to an anti-Muslim bias. Now, when it came to the media, most of them didn't know any better. I don't think most of them were malicious. They're like, oh, national security narrative, these people are experts. Yes, let's run with it because, of course, if it bleeds, it leads. Right. But the good point is, in the past 14 years, I've seen more American Muslims pick up the microphone and reclaim their narrative and become the protagonists of their narrative. And you see more people now in 2014 and 2015 on television speaking about Muslims. Muslims actually speaking about Muslims and Islam in America. Crazy thought.
But I think
then what we saw after 9/11.
But I think we need more of that, Wajahat.
Of course we do.
Definitely.
Of course we do.
I mean, I encourage people, I say, don't just tell your child, honey, tell me, do you want to be a doctor or an engineer? You know, what about being a journalist, right? Mm-hmm. A writer, a professor, you know, someone in the media. We need more voices of Muslims speaking about Islam and other Muslims.
You're preaching to the choir, sister.
You know? That's very important.
Arsalan, another phenomenon that we've seen where, you know, this concerns violent crimes in this country. Where a violent crime is committed by a Muslim, it seems to be immediately labeled terrorism.
Yeah, I mean, since 9/11, you know, the term terrorism has been co-opted in the United States to only apply when a brown Muslim man commits an act of murder. I mean, you know, recently we had the Charleston, you know, church shooting in South Carolina when Dylan Roof, you know, somebody with a white supremacist race war ideology went in and slaughtered 9 innocent African-American people in something that should have been called domestic terrorism. You know, a few years ago, we had a 48-year-old man named Joseph Stack who flew a single-engine plane into the IRS building into Austin, Texas. He left behind an anti-government ideological diatribe. Now, I assure you, if it was a brown Muslim man named Muhammad Ali who had flown a single-engine plane into an IRS building in Austin, Texas, every single IRS building, nay, every single federal building in the country would have been shut down on that day. And so, you know, part of the work that we're trying to do is to not only reclaim our own narrative as American Muslims, but call out double standards when it comes to terrorism, because it should apply to anyone who commits acts of mass murder.
Immediately we have, you know, any crime being labeled terrorist. It feeds into all those prejudices that are out there already.
I just want to add something also very important in line with what Iftikhar just said now, that also the identity, the religious identity of the person or the attacker, you know, does not get to be, you know, highlighted except if, you know, he's a Muslim. And then you see, you know, a Muslim terrorist did this and this and that. If the attack was done by someone who is Christian, you know, Jewish, of any other faith or no faith, right? You don't get any kind of media attention highlighting what the religious identity of this person is. So that adds another layer of bias that we have to be very sensitive and aware of as well. In addition to, of course, calling the act itself a terrorist act. Even these 3 young people who were shot, you know, and killed and murdered in North Carolina. Right? You know, it was like, oh, the beginning was like, oh, maybe it's a parking issue. Really? I mean, it's a parking, you know, problem that's going to lead to shooting 3 people to death in their own home. Another, you know, media story is like, oh, they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were in their home, for God's sake. How can you be in the wrong place in the wrong time when you are in your own home? So, I mean, even, you know, the severity of the incident itself and calling it, you know, a terrorist act, a vicious act of murder, is not always the case when the victims are Muslims and when the attackers are non-Muslims, you know, let alone bringing about the identity, the religious identity of who the attacker was, which only happens if the attacker is a Muslim.
Right. Wajahat, are these attitudes going to change? Is it good enough for politicians at a very senior level to say, well, you know what, this is not against Muslims, this is not against Islam, it's got nothing to do with that? Does something else need to be done?
A lot needs to be done. Yes, I do think the ideas will change, because what I always tell people, if you're a student of American history, and if you just stick with 20th century American history, what's happening to American Muslims right now is actually a remake of American history. The DNA is the same. In 1949, the best-selling book in America was written by Paul Blanchard, who was seen as a liberal, American Freedom and Catholic Power. If you look at every single meme against Muslims, they're a 5th column. They'll never integrate. They'll never be one of us. They're trying to take over. Almost the exact same memes were used against Catholics. The book was re-released 10 years later and was a bestseller again. In 1958, if you told Americans that there'd be a Catholic president or there'd be Catholics in the Supreme Court, and if you rewound 30 years and said the same thing about Jews and Jewish Americans, they would never believe you. What we're witnessing now has unique challenges, but it's happened before, and I do believe America has a reset button, but it will take all of us and all of our communities for us to achieve our best potential.